alaikum, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This will be the first installment of our new education series titled Palestine in Session. And it's such a great honor to have with us two great speakers, one of which is a little bit tardy, but she'll be joining us shortly. And the title of this webinar is Right-Wing Zionist Money and Its Influence on U.S. Elections. My name is Tariq Khalil. I am Education Coordinator with American Muslims for Palestine. The purpose of this webinar is to put the high level of spending in our elections and its influence on our politics in a larger context. But at the outset, I just want to make this very quick and short disclaimer, and that is that AMP, American Muslims for Palestine, is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We do not take any position on politics, specifically elections, whether past, present, or future. We don't support or oppose any candidates, and we take no position whatsoever on election-related matters or partisan politics. The goal of this webinar is to educate the public about the impact of money in our elections and how this hinders fair and secure elections in the future, specifically in the context of influencing elections to favor Israel and to oppose Palestinian rights. So that is the purpose of this webinar, is merely and purely and solely to educate the public on these on the spending that we know of regarding our elections and how it impacts our politics moving forward. We were going to have with us our executive director, Dr. Osama Abuirshaid. However, he could not join us. He's traveling and just doesn't have the energy to join us for this webinar, but he's been on previous webinars, and inshallah we'll have him in future ones as well. We do have with us right now Yousuf Abdelfatah. He's a human rights researcher and Ph.D. student in the Department of Politics at Princeton University. Now, Yusuf, thank you for making the time to be here, and I really want to get into just the specifics of this report that was put out by Americans Justice for Action and Americans for Justice in Palestine, AJP Action, put out this report that just has a lot of figures, a lot of data, and if you can, just briefly run through what these numbers mean. I mean, we're talking about really, really high dollar amounts. So can you put these numbers in context for us and give us some perspective on them? What do they mean, and what can we learn from them? And why do we need to know about this in our elections?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you, Tara, and thank you to AMP for having me on here. So it's interesting, right? Because one of the main places that people go to for election data, and it's cited sort of frequently in the report, is this thing called Open Secrets. Open Secrets is a nonprofit research group. They track money in U.S. politics and its effect on elections and public policy. And if you go on Open Secrets and you look at the sort of various industries and sectors that they report as spending money in U.S. elections, they have a thing called single issue groups. And single issue groups encompass what you would normally think of as the flashpoints of American politics, talking about things like gun rights, talking about things like abortion rights and so forth. But they also have a whole code just for something they call single issue pro-Israel. This is coded separately from foreign and defense policy. No other country has it. There's no single issue pro-China, single issue pro-Saudi Arabia. It's just single issue pro-Israel. And so it really gives you an idea of sort of the degree of institutionalization and the kind of apparatus that we're talking about here. And sort of the report illustrates that we've seen a distinct trend emerging in the past couple of years and a real shift in tactics from this apparatus. So we've seen that these organizations are sort of increasingly focusing much more on actual electioneering and actually putting their money into political races and into supporting candidates, or more frequently opposing candidates. For example, everybody knows about AIPAC. In 2020, AIPAC didn't have a super PAC. Now they do. And these pro-Israel PACs have been really influential in a lot of key races, sometimes even reaching the level of being the #1 spender in some of these races. And oftentimes, the tactic they use isn't even to directly address anything about Palestinian rights or Israel are saying, oh, this candidate is anti-Israel. They attack candidates on issues that often have nothing to do with Israel or candidates who are more progressive because they see them as potentially being a threat. So some of these races that we've documented never actually had public debates about Palestine, or they had very minimal sort of low-level statements. And we've seen these pro-Israel groups get involved in them. And of course, they also went after members of Congress who are seen as being pro-Palestinian or seen as, or the opposite. They try to shore up support for members of Congress who are sort of very openly pro-Israel. And as part of this trend in the past election cycle, we saw them sort of really start to coalesce behind two main players, two main political action committees. This is the Democratic Majority for Israel and the United Democracy Project. It's funny that the United Democracy Project is only purpose is to support a regime that the most prominent human rights groups have accused of apartheid, but I digress. And for just the 2022 election cycle, we've tracked more than 30 million in contributions to candidate campaigns and more than 40 million being spent on elections that both challenge candidates who support Palestinian human rights and support pro-Israel candidates sort of across the country. For reference, in the 22 election cycle, pro-Israel political campaign committees spent just under $9 million, right? So we're talking about a many-fold increase of the amount of resources that are being put into these campaigns. And much more than any other single issue areas. This is much more than the amount being spent by the gun lobby or about women or on the abortion rights issue. And a lot of the spending, interestingly, is happening sort of within the Democratic Party, right? So a good chunk of that money that we've seen being spent is actually spent within Democratic primaries, right? And these are coming to be seen as sort of the main battleground. And these are going to combat representatives who've expressed concern about what's happening, who've expressed support for Palestinians. Oftentimes, these representatives haven't even been expressly pro-Palestinian, they just express concern about the situation on the ground and about the abuse of Palestinian rights. They're also going to Democratic members of Congress who've taken pro-Israel stances. So on the opposite front, Democratic members of Congress who are very explicitly pro-Israel will pull in a lot more of this money. And this cycle, we saw Democratic representatives receiving more contributions and higher average contributions than their Republican counterparts, right? And this is important to know, right? And it's important to stop here for a second because this money doesn't just have an effect on the campaign that it's being spent on. It has a freezing effect sort of around the whole issue and around all the other candidates. If you're a candidate, you don't want this money being spent against you. So you have this, it becomes a situation where people are worried about talking about the issue at all, even if money hasn't been spent against them or in support of them already. And I think it's also worth noting sort of the size of the apparatus, right? So even if we take a step back and we think about not just direct sort of money into the campaigns, if we look at the biggest organizations and how much money they hold in assets, we're talking about sort of many, many times that of pro-Palestinian groups. So if you take the 10 largest pro-Israel groups, and these are the exact ones are cited in the report, but they hold sort of collectively about $500 million in assets. Whereas if you combine not just pro-Palestinian groups, but pro-Palestinian groups and sort of the more sort of liberally minded Zionist groups, which, as we know, aren't necessarily always the best of friends to Palestinians, but even if we include them in this number, they sort of net about a little bit more than 10 million assets. So we're talking about 50 times the amount of money that's being mobilized here. And so I know this all sounds kind of disheartening, but just the final point I want to make is to take a second and think about what does this all mean, right? So there's this huge apparatus that's being mobilized against advocates of Palestinian rights, but why? And it sounds bad and it's not great, but all the reason that all the spending has gone up, and it's gone up because of the success of the pro-Palestinian movement. That's why we see so much of the money being spent in the Democratic Party and in Democratic primaries, right? It's a reflection of an increasing conflict where we see that the Democratic electorate is becoming increasingly pro-Palestinian. And in an effort to stymie some of the success, increased resources are being sent that way. Nobody's spending money for the sake of spending money. They're spending this money because they really feel the heat. So if there's a silver lining to any of the things that we see in this report, it's that these are direct responses to what we've seen as successes that have come from the pro-Palestinian movements and from organizations like AMP who've really tried to push a narrative on this issue.
Yeah, no, wow. Thank you for laying that out. I mean, it just seems like The amount is, I mean, I'm just going to just brief comment before I introduce Ayah, who just joined us. These amounts are exorbitant. Hi, Ayah. How are you? These amounts are so exorbitant for such small congressional races, and I just find that that kind of uncontrollable spending just very problematic, and something that we have to combat in some form or another. And I'm glad to have Ayah Ziyadeh with us, who will tackle the question that I believe will answer that for us. And Ayah, thank you for being here. Ayah Ziyadeh is our advocacy director at Americans for Justice. She's she's advocacy director at Americans for Justice in Palestine, AJP Action. Thank you for being here. And Ayah, so what can we do on an advocacy level, do you think, to kind of counteract this uncontrollable spending that influences our elections? Please go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me. I think there's a lot of different ways, but on the advocacy front, one of the most basic ways is honestly for Palestinian or pro-Palestinian constituents to just take up space within policymaking spaces. One of the reasons that entities like AIPAC have been able to succeed with their funding and have such a chokehold on candidates is kind of a two-way street where they continue influence once these candidates are elected, and they maintain their influence within the spaces, like having continuous meetings, having control over or influence over what kind of policy is created. And that's by the simplest things of advocacy, in just being in the halls, having meetings. And I've heard it from multiple people, including staffers on the Hill, of it's very disproportionate. The pro-Palestinian movement versus the pro-Zionist movement within the halls of Congress, for example, are very disproportionate. So we need to be in there on a higher level in order to gain as much influence. But another thing that we can do is, ask for more transparency, ask Congress to refuse money from special interest groups, and stop dark money from infiltrating these spaces. There's an example, H.R.1 for the People Act of 2021, which was introduced by Rep. Sarbanes, and it passed the House, but unfortunately it went to the Senate and didn't come back, I believe. But this bill addressed voter access, election integrity and security, campaign finance, and ethics for the three branches of government. Specifically, the bill expands on voter registration, but it would help in kind of putting a stop on dark money, such as money that comes from organizations like AIPAC. And a little bit more background on that. Dark money groups usually are active in elections in one of two ways. They either buy ads themselves or they give money to another group, such as a super PAC, which buys the ads. And I'm not sure if Yusuf mentioned this because I was a little bit late, but with the report that we did in 2022, this money that we saw hit Democratic candidates collectively came through PACs and super PACs, which was largely formed in just the past 2 years. And so these right-wing Zionist groups contributed more than $30 million to candidate campaigns and spent more than $40 million directly into elections to challenge and support candidates across the country. So it's basic influence. It's like organizations like ours and constituents all across the country that can make the influence by having just as much presence within policymaking spaces.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that, Ayah. And I really want to just stress the point to our viewers, just in case they don't know what that term means. But both of you have used it, dark money, and that refers to that it's a form of spending to influence political outcomes where the source of the money is not disclosed. So you don't know where these millions and millions of dollars are coming from, because you don't really have to disclose them. Whereas with super PACs, you are required to disclose. But since the money is funneled through either an LLC or politically active nonprofits, what you get like a weird name. You don't know what that name, who's behind that name, and who's sending in that money. So and it's unlimited. So that's where the dollar amount goes beyond the basic contribution limits that does apply to individuals. So does this mean, and Yusuf, you sort of touched on this already, does this mean that what we're doing is actually working on the ground? That we're making such a huge change, activists, I mean, generally, in America, that AIPAC has finally decided, we can't just do what we usually did for the past few decades. We need to create a super PAC for ourselves to be able to influence elections, because they're gaining traction. This pro-Palestinian rights movement is gaining traction. Is that something that you can speak to, Yusuf? Is that, you can answer in a close-ended way and just say yes, or you can add to that.
No, I mean, I think absolutely it's definitely a reaction, right? And you see this even in the statements that they make when they talk about the success of, we've defeated X number of candidates who had these anti-Palestinian or sort of anti-Israeli stances or pro-Palestinian stances, right? These aren't statements that they would have made 10, 15 years ago because there weren't candidates who were coming in with pro-Palestinian stances. That's something new, and that's a result of the success of the sort of pro-Palestinian movement and human rights activists and activists who've been working for years on this. What I'll also add is that doesn't mean that we can sort of sit back and be like, oh, we're succeeding, right? Like, they're now in response stepping it up, which means that we also have to step it up, right? Like Ayah said, we need more people sort of in the halls of Congress. We need more people in advocacy meetings. We need to field our own candidates, things like that.
Ayah, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, briefly, I do think absolutely, like, this increase in spending and contributions was prompted by an increase in Palestinian or support for the Palestine movement within Congress specifically, because on a level more than ever before, you see a lot of members, whether they have any affiliation or not, they're increasingly starting to back Palestinians and vocalize support for Palestinians. And there's like so many reports that came out this year that talked about, like, the more that Americans learn about Israel, the more they dislike it, or the Israeli government, and the more there's like 40% of Jews under 40, American Jews under 40, are not pro-Israel. And there's so many different statistics that are coming out, and I do think that was prompted, and you can see it because in this past election, these contributions targeted the top 10 recipients were Democrats, because there's a large shift in the Democratic Party in support of Palestinian rights.
And interesting, and I'm glad you ended it on that note. It's not, we're not talking about some kind of radical shift. We're just saying, just the mere comment that we want to condition aid. I'm not saying we want to end the aid. I'm saying we want to condition aid. Israel can have this money that we've been giving Israel for year after year after year, but you can't use that money to oppress Palestinian children, to treat them inhumanely, to seize territory. It's so on and so forth. So it seems as though even what's considered moderate positions are anathema to groups like AIPAC or pro-Israel groups. So, I mean, what does that say for future elections if there's a candidate that just wants to express a moderate view and just some semblance of feeling towards the Palestinians? Does that mean now there's going to be this huge funneling of money to campaign against them? Yusuf?
I think that's part of the strategy, right? Is the reason that there are these, now that we have these PACs and that they've spent so much money in the last election cycle is, and I touched on this a little bit when I was in my sort of first set of remarks, is there's an effort to sort of freeze the conversation, right? So if candidates, especially new candidates, so especially challengers who aren't incumbents, who might have less resources coming in, are the hope sort of by these groups is that they'll be less likely to talk about Palestinian rights because they don't want all of this money mobilized against them, right? Now, that's the hope. And then some candidates, of course, won't cave into that pressure. Some candidates will have sort of come in with sort of certain principles, and they're going to stick to those principles, and regardless of the money that comes in. But some candidates, especially candidates who are either less informed on the issue or this isn't one of their primary issues, might just choose to say nothing, right? And so that sort of goes back to why it's important that pro-Palestinian groups are just as vocal or are able to mobilize more and more resources as time goes on.
Man, I just it's a little disheartening because you want to be able to convince candidates that want to run for office to have the right positions, but it's difficult in this kind of uncontrollable spending climate that we're in. But I want to move on to the something that Ayah mentioned, H.R.1 for the People Act. So obviously the opposition to it seems clear, but how does the public learn more about the necessity to have this, not just in the context of Israel or Palestine, but in the context of just generally spending habits and putting some integrity into our election system? What do you think can be done in that regard?
In terms of learning about it or pushing
both.
Pushing for it? Well, yeah, there's a lot of resources online because we're not the only kinds of organizations that speak to campaign finance issues. I mean, dark money is an issue everywhere and with every single issue. So there's so many resources online that people can have access to. But I think the number one thing goes back to what Yusuf and I both are continuously pushing for, which is consistent advocacy. We need to use our rights as constituents to be pushing for whatever we believe in the halls of policymaking spaces. And this is not just limited to Congress. This is Congress. This is state and local elections. And so I think, if you agree with HR1 and you believe that it should be passed, email your Congress member, email your senator, because it went to the Senate and it didn't come back to the House. So use your voice, just like we see, again, going back to the issue of why are organizations like AIPAC so successful. It's because they have a member base that is so determined to complete the mission of AIPAC that they are continuously in these spaces. And I'm talking about week to week, not like, every other month, once a year, twice a year, literally week to week. And we should be pressuring on the same level. And I believe that legislation such as this one wouldn't only help the Palestinian movement, it would help a lot of different issues within the US, which is important.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Ayah. I 100% agree. I hope the audience heard that part, because we definitely need to get to work on that front, and of course other fronts as well. Yusuf, you mentioned the level of spending, and you gave us the figures and why they're important and how high they are, how exorbitant they are. But why is the focus so much on the primaries and regarding one party instead of the general election, where that's where the person eventually is ultimately elected to Congress? So what's this sole focus on primaries all about?
Yeah, so there's sort of two answers to that question. One of the answers is sort of what both A and I have already talked about, is that there's sort of been an increasing shift within the Democratic electorate towards a more and more pro-Palestinian stance. And because of that, there's a lot of money that's being funneled into primaries being seen as sort of an ideological battleground almost within single parties, because you have the primary obviously is within two candidates from the same party. And so the idea is that to counteract this push from the electorate, put more and more money into the candidates that are within the affected party, the Democratic Party, that are more pro-Israel, to sort of push that back. The other reason for it is that as we have more and more sort of national polarization, and there's more districts that are sort of red districts or blue districts, that the general election isn't really a toss-up in a lot of these districts. Like in a lot of districts, the incumbent party is sort of always expected to win, barring some sort of huge shift. And in those districts, the primary is almost basically the general election, right? Whoever wins from the incumbent party is the one who's going to win the seat most of the time. And so there's also an increasing focus there, because that's seen as sort of this is the real election, and then the odds that the incumbent party is going to lose is sort of less. So the focus has become increasingly on primaries for both of those reasons.
So just a quick follow-up on that. So why are these ads and the campaigning is focused on issues that are not related to Israel at all? So if these organizations, UDP and DMFI, if their focus is to strengthen the U.S.-Israel relationship, why are these ads focused on healthcare and the economy and whatever it is? I mean, all other issues that have nothing to do with their mission statement at all.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because this is sort of a really interesting aspect of their sort of strategy, is that they're not, in a lot of these elections, you don't actually see a lot of talk about Palestinians or about Israelis or about the occupation. But the candidate, either sometimes they had sort of very sort of basic low-level statements about Palestine, and there isn't really much to hit them on in there at all. There's sort of very basic human rights complaints, or they haven't said much of anything. There hasn't really been much public debate, but they're worried that the candidate will sort of be will push for sort of pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli stances, and so they attack them on the things that they think will work. So sometimes you'll have, in some of these races, you saw candidates being attacked because, oh, this candidate didn't support Joe Biden enough, and so they're not really a true Democrat. Or that's like a very consistent line of attack that happens a lot with I don't want to name specific candidates, but it happens with more than one candidate. And the idea there is that and also part of it is that they know that they're losing, right? The narrative game. Ayah gave some really good statistics about how the American electorate is becoming sort of more and more disenchanted by Israel and by the occupation, and starting to lean more and more towards Palestinians. So that's not an effective strategy for sort of national messaging or for ads. And so they sort of try to remain entrenched in sort of their powerful positions within Congress by attacking on issues that people will care about.
Yeah, because they can care less about what their view is on healthcare or what their view is on the economy. They just want them to win.
Exactly.
Okay. Oh my God. Okay, there is a question here from the audience. I'll read it the way that it's written. I don't know if who would like to answer that, but it's from Maxwell No, the question is regarding that. So I know it's a bit early, but Maxwell Frost notably scrubbed Palestine from his platform after getting the endorsement from Apex, Michelle Richie Torres. Would you agree that Zionist and liberal Zionist organizations are going to try to play both sides in order to make a play for the old position of there's no sunlight between GOP and Democratic on the issue of Israel? So basically back to I don't think we've left the status quo yet. But it's growing in the progressive wing. But what say you, Ayah? Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I'm just reading the question one more time.
Yeah, it's kind of a lengthy one, but I wanted to give Yawushu. I'm definitely mispronouncing that name. Sorry about that.
I think it's a tricky question because the U.S. as a whole is tricky when it comes to Israel. The truth lies when we look at the Biden administration, for example, and compare it to Trump on Palestine. There is not a difference, to be frank. There hasn't been a change, and if anything, we haven't corrected what Trump has done. So it's a tricky question. There's been a lot of change when it comes to Congress and when it comes to the party itself, at the end of the day, the decisions are made based off of interest. I think that's where we can leave it at, is every decision, whether it's the GOP or the Democratic Party, decisions are made based off of interest.
Yeah, and Yusuf, did you want to respond to that? Sorry.
No, I think Ayah really covered it. I mean, I don't know if I think there has been some big changes sort of on individual level, right, between some members of Congress. I think we have probably a lot more members of Congress now who are willing to express certain positions than they would have 10, 15 years ago. But at a party level, I don't think the status quo really has changed much. I think we're still very close to that no sunlight. There's small cracks and small fractures, which is what has them worried. But I think I don't think on a party level things have changed much. It's still very, 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 very interest based, like Ayah said.
Yeah, and interestingly, if you look at the polling, Pew Research, Gallup, and so on, and you see this trend within particular age groups. So they'll categorize the constituents from moderate to liberal, and they make the distinction between the Democrat moderate and Democrat liberal. And it seems as though if you're on the Democrat liberal end and you're between that high 20s, late 30s age group, you've already crossed the threshold into a more pro-Palestinian stance. So I think that there's an age component here that's really, and now with trying to make voting trendy, trying to make it popular among young folks to increase the turnout amongst young people. And I think that's what will get people to vote for candidates that do express an unapologetically pro-Palestinian stance and not care what the results end up being, because they will eventually stand on principle. That's not the same kind of politics that AIPAC and pro-Israel organizations are used to. So I think from my standpoint, I feel as though, so with that younger generation growing in its political activity, I think that's what can really make a very deep change in the makeup of our Congress. I mean, there's already been attacks on members of Congress for just simple tweets that they put out that seem non-controversial on its face, factually, but still, the label has grown now that this is anti-Semitic and so on. But these super PACs, their target is not anti-Jewish bigotry. Their target is to protect the state of Israel, to protect a foreign entity. So do you think that angle is an important angle that we can use to influence the public to, when they vote, to understand that, you're voting for a candidate that's been heavily funded by an institution that really only cares about one country, and it's not the one that you're living in? Is that an angle that you think that can change the trajectory of how people think about who they vote for? Yes, Ayah?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things that has helped the statistics have a shift in narrative. I think that angle, as well as just what the state that they are supporting is doing to Palestinians. I do think, unfortunately, because the United States is such a large ally of Israel, there has been so much propaganda in the narrative. And now that the narrative is being reclaimed by Palestinians and people are being exposed to more education on what is actually happening on the ground, I think both angles, yes, can help. And one of them is that, first of all, they're focusing on a country that isn't even the country you're living in. Second of all, the country that they're focusing on is harming people and not only going against international law, but against U.S. standards as well.
Yeah, and did you want to respond to that? I wanted to comment on her.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just want to really underline sort of Ayah's last point there. I think it's a really important point, is that, and I'm pretty sure she's mentioned the statistic already, but the more Americans learn about the occupation, the more they learn about Israel and what's happening under the occupation, the less supportive of Israel they are, right? And so pushing or reclaiming that narrative and sort of trying to show that their narrative is false is super, super important. And sort of exposing the crimes that are happening, exposing what's happening to Palestinians, I think more than anything, that's really what's shifting the narrative, or what's shifting the people's perspective on this.
Yeah, and one very popular example, at least now it's become very popular over the last 2 to 4 years, is HR 2590, and its prior provisions, prior resolutions as well. And it seems as though on its face, it seems, I think, actually kind of innocuous. It's asking for the bare minimum. It's not. It even on the question of annexation, it just says ending the continued annexation. It doesn't even say remove the settlements that have already been established. It just says don't take more, don't kick people out of their homes, don't abuse children. It's such a simple proposition, and we're still only at 32 co-sponsors. So, yeah, and I can also spin that and to say it was only 27 or so a year or two ago. So we gained five more co-sponsors on that. So something as simple as that, I think, can go a long way, because that resolution is going nowhere. But it's up to us to make sure that we push for something that can really gravitate towards a larger audience. And at the end of the day, just like Ayah said, this is not a one day job. You have to work at this daily and monthly and yearly, and it's going to take more than one phone call. Ayah, I know, mentioned to make a phone call to congressman or congresswoman, but one will not be enough. You have to email. You have to try to reach out in other ways and ask for the support. And if you have to condemn a certain resolution, you ask for that as well. I want to just end on a positive note, okay, if possible. So I would like to. There you go. Thank you for that comment. This is definitely a marathon and not a sprint. It will take time, but we are getting closer, and the polls are showing that. Just like Yusuf said, and what Yusuf said is actually backed by polling. The more that Americans learn about what is happening on the ground, the more distant they've become vis-a-vis Israel. So that's just based on scientific fact. So that's very important that we educate the public on what is actually happening on the ground. Can we end on a positive note, if possible? What positive sign do you see that we can look to counteract this $40+ million of spending that you just outlined, Yusuf, in our congressional elections? What can we look to say, well, okay, we have this huge monster in front of us, but we're going in the right direction, and here's why.
I think the polling that you just mentioned, right, and as Ayah also mentioned, is a positive sign, right? Like we're seeing, and as you mentioned, there's an age difference where we're seeing a generational change. We're seeing change across the electorate and across the country. In a sort of perverse way, this $40 million in spending is itself a sign that they're feeling the heat. Like this money isn't being spent like just for the sake of spending the money. This money is being spent because they feel that it's necessary, because they're feeling the heat and they're feeling sort of the wave of pro-Palestinian sentiment and the work of pro-Palestinian activists and human rights activists. So the fact that they're spending the money is not good, but the fact that they have to spend that money is a good thing.
Final thoughts. Please keep it positive.
I think the money that this might be controversial to some people, but I've said this a couple times. I think that the money that they pumped into the past elections is a positive sign. And the fact that they pumped more money than the top 3 issues in the US, right? Just for Israel. And yet, most of the candidates they tried to defeat won in this past election. And so I think that's a positive sign altogether. That doesn't take away from the fact that we have a lot of work to do. We do. So I really hope that between now and the next elections, that, going back to what I said earlier, that as residents of the US, as constituents, as the people that pay these politicians, we can apply more pressure, watch who we elect and don't elect. And then once they are in office, what are we doing to make sure that they're listening to us and not just to the other side?
Thank you for that positive note. We want to encourage our audience that, these types of webinars, these types of sessions is to educate on what is happening, but to never lose hope, and to always believe that we can definitely overcome. And I believe that the spending itself, and you've both mentioned this, the spending itself is evidence that we're doing something right. If we were not effective, AIPAC would not have set up Super PAC. It just wouldn't even be necessary at that point. So just a couple of closing remarks before I give an announcement. I did want to mention, Ayah, you want to make a comment, please?
Yeah, I actually, on that note, on the advocacy front for AGP Action, we are going to be releasing an urgent action alert on what happened in Jenin and just any escalations that are occurring. So please watch out for that. If you are not subscribed to our email at AGP Action, please go do that. You can find it on our website, and subscribe to our newsletter, and you will also find our action alert on there. It's incredibly urgent, and this is the step that you can take immediately. It will take you a couple minutes, so please watch out for that tonight.
Thank you for that, Ayah. And before I make one last announcement, I would be remiss if I did not mention the Israeli raid on Jenin that happened yesterday. I think from reports says at least 9, but I believe the number is 10 now. 10 Palestinians killed and approximately 20 injured. And just in the year 2022 alone, more than 170 Palestinians were killed in such raids. And a notable example of a killing that occurred in Jenin was Shireen Abu Akleh. And so, our hearts go out to the families of the 10 that were massacred in Jenin. And ANP put out a statement as well. This is not just an isolated incident. This is part of a pattern. It's part of a pattern of inhuman acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression against an indigenous population, and while imposing racial domination on that group. There's a word for that, and that word is apartheid. And this is exactly the effects of an apartheid regime, what you saw in Jenin yesterday, and the occupation continues, and the settler colonial project is still ongoing, and we must do what we can to fight against it, to bring awareness, and to respond effectively, and to keep our heads high, and to honor our victims of Israeli atrocities. So on that note, Ramadan is coming up. It's that time of year that ANP relaunches its annual Israeli date boycott. We're reaching out to you to invite you to participate in this imperative campaign. Let's start with step 1. Sign our pledge to boycott Israeli dates in support of justice for the Palestinian people. ampalestine.org/date boycott. Again, that's ampalestine.org/date boycott, and share it on your social media. Stay tuned for more campaigns and actions soon. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and thank you to our guests, and have a blessed night. Thank you.